Okay, so what does this auto button do? If we click it, it didn't help. Made things worse. What is this? What's going on? Well, we have to understand that there can be multiple versions of the auto. And in fact, we can find that out by clicking on the flyout menu, and go to the, if I can click here, go to the auto options. Now, auto options has a few different methods available to it. Enhance monochromatic contrast, enhance per channel contrast, find dark and light colors, enhance brightness and contrast. So by default, at least in this version of Photoshop, enhance brightness and contrast is the default properties of this button. So just pressing OK, boom, that's what it does. So you'll notice it does this kind of thing called an S curve. Talk more about that in just a minute. So let's bring that menu back up and we'll go to auto options. So what happens if we enhance monochromatic contrast? It's different. What about enhance per channel contrast? Well, that's better. That's actually improving things. Find lights and darks. We got weird color cast going on now. Enhance brightness and contrast is right back where we started. What are these? What's happening? Why do some of them have clipping and some of them don't have clipping? What's happening on this? Well, it turns out that these actually relate to an older adjustment under image adjustments. We have some automatic controls here. Essentially, enhance monochromatic is the same thing as image auto contrast, which is in here somewhere. Image auto tone, auto contrast, auto color. Oh, sorry, it's not under adjustment. So we have image auto tone. Oops, can't do that on a curves layer. It won't do anything. Let me duplicate this so I don't destroy everything. Image auto tone. Image auto contrast, and image auto color. So these three effects correspond with there we are. Flyout menu. Come on. Auto options. There we go. These three effects, then we get one extra one. So what they are is this. Enhanced monochromatic contrast is the same as image auto contrast. So that's it. It's an auto contrast. Okay. I don't know why they had to call it monochromatic, but hey, they did. That's not even fully accurate. It changed the blue. Enhanced per channel contrast is the same thing as auto tone. Per channel contrast, the same one as auto tone. Find dark and light is about the same thing as auto color. And then we have enhanced brightness and contrast, which is essentially just an S curve being applied with a little bit of clipping where it goes in. Speaking of clipping, these autos are in fact a little bit better than the image auto adjustment because we can go in and have any clipping. That is, how far into the data is this going? If you're working with scientific data, you don't want to clip. That will ruin everything. So if you set the clips to 0 here, then you can see this is as far as you can go without it actually going into the data. At the 0.1%, which is the default, it will dig in about 1% on this stuff. And so that means that on the RGBs, it's just going into the 1% on each of these colors, since it's only going to 1 there. If you want, you can crank this up a ton, like 5%. And get like some serious like high contrast happening in here, but usually don't. In fact, because of these auto clips, it's usually not good to use auto. It's just as easy to actually do it by hand because you're not always sure what's going on. If you absolutely have to use it, do the auto options instead, just so you can know what's happening. If you want to get back to the original defaults, hold down the Alt or Option key on a Macintosh and click Reset, boom, and you'll get them back to where they were, or at least we'll try. In some weird cases, it doesn't have that, and so you have to remember and type them in or clear out your preferences inside your computer. And you usually do that by holding down Control, Shift, and Alt when you open the program, but that will clear out all of your preferences and will do stuff like delete your saved brushes and all that, so it's kind of a pain. You also have the option in a lot of these to snap your neutral midtone, not the enhanced brightness and contrast, which is just the S curve. But on these guys, if you snap to the neutral midtone, it will let you choose what you want the neutral to be. And that's actually more useful than a lot of these. Remember when we were hunting and pecking on the rocks? And tries to calculate it itself. So if you don't clip it and you instead just find the neutral, snap the neutral, you can get rid of color casting pretty quickly, which is pretty cool. Except, yet again, while it tried to neutralize it, notice it didn't do a perfect job of in the clouds. We still have some magenta, and I see like a weird yellow cast on some of this stuff now. So it did its best, and it's still not quite good enough. All right, that said, you can save as defaults, but you don't usually want to do that. You just use the defaults when you want to, you want the original defaults most of the time. Okay, that said, I keep saying, oh, what's an S-curve? We'll talk about it. What's an S-curve? We'll talk about it. Let's go ahead and talk about an S-curve. So an S-curve is generally the default version of making something better. So you've got a few curves. Like if you just want to brighten stuff, right? You do that. If you just want to darken stuff, you do that. If you want to make it a little steeper, you can just drag these in, and then that will bring up the contrast. So you've got all these cool tools that do some clipping, but there's one you'll see a lot. And here's my personal favorite S-curve. It's usually going about 20%. And remember, we set this grid to have the tens. So about here, pull that up just a little bit. Go in, that's 20% in from the white. Let's go in 20% from the black, pull it down a little bit. And if it starts to move off the middle, go and put a middle point. You usually don't have to. I'm going to press delete. And that's about an S-curve. If you need to, pull in your black and white. I like points. I like to use the Alt key so that I can see what's changing. And then if you need to, you can readjust your S-curve as needed. Notice that it's still crossing the midpoint. So what's happening here? For the most part, it's just increasing the steepness, which means that it's making more contrast. In other words, the lights are getting lighter and the darks are getting darker, but it also tapers it off. So this is a little bit different. Because it's tapering off at the endpoints, the highlight range and the shadow range become less steep, and it's reducing the contrast in the brightest highlights and the darkest shadows. So instead of just cutting it off like you do with the levels tool, it's trying to leave it alone so it doesn't squash it all down. Because if we brought this in a ton, notice it's getting close to being removed, it's getting squished, but it's not flat out becoming flat out getting flat. That's kind of a weird way to say it. It's not becoming a flat line. This flat line is what it would be on the levels. We literally are just losing data. It's 100% black. By using the S-curve instead, drag that down, it's tapering. So it's squishing it, and by squishing I mean these darks are getting much darker much more rapidly, but they're not black. So you haven't lost any data like you would on the levels. That alone makes curves much more efficient than levels does for most things. And by most things, I mean art, photography, that kind of thing, simply because you aren't just throwing away stuff. You're actually compressing the data in some other way. So it's still there. You can still see it with your human eye. It's just less evident. And really, I think that's incredibly valuable. And so you see S-curves a lot. So now that we know what these tools do, let's see if we can do a quick adjustment. Let me get rid of these bad boys. Boom, since we don't need them anymore. Delete, delete, delete. So starting back off on the original image, adding a curves. How do we do this? Well, hold down the Alt key, drag in until I start clipping data, decide if that data matters. It's just the blue cast in the shadows, not too much, so I can let it clip in. Hold down the Alt key again. I don't want to clip that sky data because that's important, so get rid of that. There we go. Go ahead and add a slight S-curve, about 20% into the data here, about 20% into the data there. Here we go. Get rid of the color cast by coming in with this gray eyedropper tool. I know that one of these rocks, I think it's this one. There we go. Should get rid of most of the color cast, but not quite all of it. So let's start by let's go ahead and get rid of it. That way, Okay, and then I don't like all this extra magenta. Now we know that going to the green channel, I can increase the green in the sky. Not that much. Using the arrow tool. And maybe decrease the green in the no, about there. Oh, I do need to do that. Decrease the green over here. I'm having regrets about the grays. So I'm actually going to clear this one out. And I'm going to do it by hand. Instead, I believe that we went over this earlier too. So on the blue, don't want to clip in on anything. Don't want to clip in on anything. On the green, don't want to clip in. Oh, don't want to clip in. On the red, don't want to clip in. Don't want to clip in. There we go. It looks like we still have a bit of a green cast. Oh, that looks much better though. The magenta's gone in the sky. So I'll leave that alone, but this is way too green. There we go. I want a little more like that. Okay, I think that looks pretty good. Sometimes you want to add a little bit of a color cast. So before, after. I might have darkened it too much. Not a problem. Just pull that back. Lighten it up. Just a little bit. There you go. Now I put a little bit of my own personal taste on this. I kind of like the heavy contrast. I like the slight tints of color that I have in different places. But you can also just remove those by playing around with the curves a little bit more. That said, there are a few more tools that are pretty useful. I'll show you in the next video.